Hello and welcome to Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris, and if you're new here, I do sewing and DIY tutorials each week. So if you're interested in that, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below. This week, I thought I would talk to you about working with knit and performance fabrics. So I know that when I started out strictly with woven fabrics, and there was almost this mysterious thing about knit fabrics, like they stretch and things were a little different. So I thought I would put together a couple of tips and tricks that I've learned along the way that can hopefully help you out too. So let's get to it. Tip number 1. It's all about the basics. That being the thread that you use, as well as the needle that you're using. So contrary to woven fabrics, a knit fabric requires a ball tip needle. So a pointy, sharp needle is not good for knits. What it's going to do is it's going to pierce the fabric and snag, and you might get skip stitches. So if you're seeing skip stitches, try changing out your needle. And even if you are using a ballpoint, jersey, or stretch needle, perhaps it's a little bit old and you need to change it up. So if you are getting those skip stitches, first thing I always do is change my needle. The next thing that you need to think about is the type of thread that you're using. Because it is a knit fabric and it's going to stretch and you need it to glide nicely in between those looped fibers, you want a strong, silky thread. So that would be a nice good polyester, such as a Gutermann. If you're using a cotton thread, that's not the greatest for knits. And it also might cause some skipping in your stitches because the cotton thread is really fuzzy. So if you've ever taken a look at a roll or a spool of cotton thread, it's a bit fuzzy on the outside, and that will get caught and worn, and it's just not as durable as that polyester thread. Tip number 2. If your fabric stretches, your seams have to stretch as well. And so what that means is selecting the right stitch for you. So I've got a guide that you can download to select the right stitch for your knit fabric, and I'll leave it in the description down below. That being said, there are a couple of stitches that I want to introduce you to for some knit stitching. First, we're going to talk straight stitches. Now the first one is a long straight stitch, about 3 millimeters, that you pull along with the fabric. So you stretch the fabric as you sew. That way, when you are done sewing and your fabric bounces back to its original shape, your stitches are going to be closer together, but it also enables the ability for it to stretch and move. Now, a con on this method is it's not very strong. The next stitch is the triple security stitch. So this one is, out of all of them, one of the strongest stitches. And when you pull the seams apart, when you're stretching and moving, you don't see a lot of that stitches. So I decided to use black fabric with white thread to kind of show you as I'm stretching each one of these samples. And really what this one does is it does 3 straight stitches all in a row and continues to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. The third straight stitch that we're going to talk about is using a twin needle. So this gives your hems a nice professional finish along the edges. Now, it's not something that you would sew 2 seams together with. This is more of a finishing and a hem. So if you're not putting cuffs on, you might want to use a twin needle to fix the bottom of the shirt, the cuffs, or the collared neckline with a nice twin needle. It's nice and elastic, and it almost looks like a zigzag on the other side. Now we're going to talk about the zigzag stitches. So in the zigzag stitches, the first one we have is a narrow, tight zigzag stitch. So you're going to want to turn your length as well as your width right down, and then you're just going to stitch it as normal. Now, the pros on this one is it is rather durable and it behaves like a straight stitch, yet is much more elastic. The next zigzag stitch I wanted to talk to you about is the lightning bolt stitch. Now, not all sewing machines have the lightning bolt stitch, But if yours does, it behaves the exact same as that narrow zigzag stitch I talked about earlier. So it just saves you the step of reducing the length and the width on your computer or your sewing machine. And it's also just a little bit longer. So it has the length goes a little bit down like a lightning bolt on that one. Another zigzag stitch that you can use is the long, narrow zigzag stitch. So you're going to increase the length of the stitches, but you're going to decrease the width of them. And this one behaves like a straight stitch. It does have some elasticity, but it's not that durable and it's not nearly as elastic as some of the other options out there. And the last zigzag stitch I wanted to talk to you about is the triple zigzag stitch. Now my machine also has a double zigzag stitch. You can use that one, but I wanted to talk about the triple just because it is a little bit more durable on that. So you're actually getting 3 small stitches into each one of the segments on the zigzag so that you're getting a much stronger stitch than if you were to do the whole stitch in the zigzag. So it's a lot stronger. Now that being said, when you do pull it apart, you can see some of the threads. So just keep that in mind when you're switching that up. And lastly, I wanted to talk to you about overlock stitches. So these ones are by far the best choice if you have them. So the first one is done on your regular old sewing machine. So a lot of sewing machines, not all, but most, have an overlock stitch. Now you're going to want to change your presser foot for this, but essentially you just line it up with the corner of your fabric or the edge of your fabric, and then you stitch, and it looks very close to what a serger or an overlocker would do. Now, one of the cons on this is it is so slow, like painstakingly slow. So I don't know if you're a slow sewist or a fast sewist, but I'm the one that like cranks the speed up to max and puts my foot pedal down, kind of like pedal to the metal. And when I'm doing it even on max on this stitch, it is so slow. I can't be bothered with it. Now, one of the best ways to finish your stitches on a knit is an overlocker or a serger. So this one cuts off the fabric as you're stitching, creating a nice clean edge for you to go on. It's nice and strong and very stretchy, and it makes sewing knits so incredibly fast. And it is by far my go-to. And sometimes if I'm doing some workout clothing and I want that little extra seam, what I'll do is I'll sew down with a lightning bolt seam, and then I'll go back over with the overlocker. One thing to note on the overlocker is to pay attention to the differential feed. Now, if you have your feed cranked to 2, you're going to get some puckers because of the way that the feed dogs are pushing the fabric in. You want to ensure that you have your differential feed set to 1 for knits, and it gives a beautiful result. So if you're finding some odd results with your serger, check that differential feed. Tip number 3. It's all about the seams. So if you're used to working with woven fabrics, particularly indie patterns, then you will be used to having a little bit larger seam allowances. Now, knit fabrics and patterns typically have smaller seam allowances, that being about 1/4 of an inch, or where the edge of your blade on your serger cuts to where the end of the stitching lies. And so they are typically tailored to working with an overlocker or a serger. And if you're stitching them just on your regular old sewing machine, that is fine. Just pay careful attention to what it says in the pattern. Now, some of them, such as sweatshirts, might have a little bit larger seam allowances. Just make sure you double check that. And if you want a really nice touch, you can also flat felt some of those seam allowances, which is essentially putting a little bit of top stitching line to hold that seam allowance flat along the other side, kind of like how we do it with jeans. Tip number 4. It's all about those finishing touches. So with a knit, they don't typically fray all that much. Now, you could leave them open along the bottom. You could put a band of ribbing or binding along the bottom, or you could use a cover stitch machine if you're so lucky enough to have one, or an alternative to a cover stitch machine, and it looks virtually identical to a cover stitch stitching, is using a twin needle. And I honestly prefer one that's about 4 millimeters apart. It just gives a nice professional touch to the end of your garment. Tip number 5. It's all about picking the right knit. So not all knits are created equal. That is correct. Some of them will have widthwise stretch, and some of them will have lengthwise stretch, and some of them will have both. So when selecting a knit, it's important to note the weight, the drape, and the percentage of stretch that you have in that fabric, and to make sure that it accommodates the garment that you're going to be stretching. So for example, a jersey knit that you would use for a sweatshirt has probably about 15 to 25% stretch in it. You could not make a bathing suit out of that because you would not get it over your bottom when you're trying to step into it. It would not stretch over your body. Or if you made it large enough to fit your body, it would be so saggy and it wouldn't fit right. So I've got a handy printout that you can use to help determine what percentage of stretch your fabric is. So you want to get a swatch of fabric that is 4 inches in length. You're going to hold it along the edge, and then you are going to stretch that fabric. If it stretches all the way to 4 inches, that's 100% stretch because it has essentially doubled the amount that it can stretch. Now don't overstretch it, just stretch it to where it feels comfortable. Now, if it gets to 3 inches, that's about 75% stretch. And if it gets to 2 inches, 50%. And if it gets to 1 inch, that's about 25% stretch. And just make sure when you are selecting the fabric, you are checking against that. And on the patterns, it will usually indicate how much stretch you should have. And a lot of the patterns actually have a guide where it says hold the fabric here and pull to here, and then you know your fabric's good. So don't forget to look at that on your pattern envelope. Tip number 6. So when you're cutting out knits, you can either invest in some ballpoint pins, which are good because it'll also help to hold your project together as you are sewing. Or what I personally like to do is use pattern weights and a rotary cutter to cut it out. Because the fabric stretches, I find when you cut it out with scissors, you don't get as accurate of a pattern piece as if you were using a rotary cutter. And for pattern weights, my personal favorite is going to the hardware store and getting the largest, heaviest washers that they have in the bins. And they're only about $1.50 Canadian for each one. And they do the trick. So there you have it. Some tips and tricks to help you out on your next project. I'd love to hear from you and know what you are sewing. And if you're having any problems and have some questions, please feel free to ask. I would love to help you guys out. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. And if you haven't done so already, don't forget to subscribe down below and hit that bell notification so you can see more. Until next time, makers, let's get our Sew-Spiration on.